The morning my son handed me termination papers from my own company, he was smiling. Not a nervous smile. Not an apologetic smile. The kind of smile you wear when you think you've already won. He stood in the doorway of the conference room, the same conference room where I had signed the lease 31 years ago, with his arms crossed and his lawyer beside him, and he said, "Dad, it's time for you to step back. We've made it official." I looked at the papers. I looked at my son. Then I looked at the lawyer and asked him one quiet question. The lawyer's face went the color of old chalk. But let me back up, because none of this happened overnight, and if you're going to understand what I did and why I don't regret a single second of it, you need to understand how we got there. My name is Gerald. I'm 64 years old. I spent 31 years building Harmon Medical Supplies from a 2-room office in Columbus, Ohio, into a regional distributor with 11 employees, 3 warehouse facilities, and contracts with hospital networks across the Midwest. I didn't inherit money. I didn't have investors in the beginning. I had a pickup truck, a credit card with a $4,000 limit, and a wife named Carol who believed in me before I believed in myself. Carol passed away 3 years ago, pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to gone. I still reach for the phone to call her sometimes when something good happens at work. That probably tells you everything you need to know about the kind of marriage we had. My son's name is Derek. He's 38. Smart kid, genuinely smart. Not just in the way fathers say it. He has a real mind for operations, for systems, for making processes efficient. I brought him into the company 12 years ago as a logistics coordinator, and I watched him grow. I promoted him. I gave him responsibility. 3 years ago, after Carol died, and I was struggling to keep my head above water emotionally, I made him president and CEO. I thought it was time. I thought he was ready. I thought a lot of things that turned out to be wrong. His wife's name is Brittany. She'd been in the picture for about 5 years at that point. Attractive, confident, the kind of woman who makes you feel slightly underdressed at your own dinner table. I never disliked her. I just never fully relaxed around her either. Carol used to say, "That girl keeps a ledger, Gerald. She's always adding things up." I'd tell her she was being too hard on the girl. I wish I'd listened. About 8 months after Derek took over as CEO, I started noticing things. Small things at first. Invoices I didn't recognize. A vendor contract that had been renegotiated without my knowledge and not in our favor. A line item in the quarterly report labeled executive consulting for $42,000 that I couldn't trace to any actual consultant. I was still chairman of the board. I still owned 51% of the company. But Derek had slowly, quietly moved me out of the daily flow of information. Emails stopped CCing me. Meeting invitations got accidentally left off my calendar. When I'd ask questions, he'd say, "Dad, you don't need to worry about that anymore. That's what you promoted me for, remember?" I gave him the benefit of the doubt longer than I should have. He was grieving his mother too. We both were. And there's something about watching your child take the wheel of something you built that makes you want to trust them completely, even when the evidence says you shouldn't. The thing that finally broke through my patience wasn't a financial irregularity. It was a Tuesday afternoon phone call from Raymond Chu. Raymond had been our accountant for 19 years. He was quiet, meticulous, the kind of man who triple-checked figures not because he doubted himself, but because he believed accuracy was a form of respect. He called me on my personal cell, not the office line, which told me everything before he said a word. "Gerald," he said, "I need to talk to you, not at the office. Can you meet me somewhere?" We met at a diner 2 towns over. Raymond sat across from me with a manila folder and the expression of a man delivering a terminal diagnosis. He laid out what he'd found over the previous 4 months. Derek and Brittany had been systematically redirecting company funds. Not huge sums at once, they were too careful for that. Small transfers, repeated expenses, a management fee paid to a shell LLC registered in Brittany's maiden name. Over 18 months, Raymond estimated the total at somewhere between $200,000 and $240,000. There was something else. Derek had approached 2 of our 3 minority shareholders, men who each owned small stakes, old friends of mine who'd invested early on, and told them that I was planning to sell the company to a larger distributor. He'd implied that they should sell their shares to him now, before the value got complicated in a merger. Both of them had. Derek now controlled 31% of the company. Combined with any proxy arrangement, he was positioning himself to make a move. Raymond slid one more piece of paper across the table. It was a document already prepared, already notarized, that would transfer my remaining 51% into a family trust managed jointly by Derek and Brittany. My signature was on it, except I had never signed it. I sat there for a long moment looking at my forged signature on a document that would have handed my company, Carol's company, the thing we built together, to two people who had been stealing from it for a year and a half. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't pound the table. I folded the copy Raymond had made for me, put it in my jacket pocket, and said, "Thank you, Raymond. I need you to keep this between us for now." He nodded. He understood. Then he said, "Gerald, I should have come to you sooner. I'm sorry." I told him it wasn't his fault. I drove home and sat in the dark in Carol's chair for about an hour. Then I made a phone call. The person I called was a woman named Patricia Osman. Patricia was a corporate attorney I'd worked with 15 years ago on a contract dispute, one of the sharpest legal minds I'd ever encountered. She didn't specialize in fraud, she specialized in corporate governance, but in this case those things overlapped considerably. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Gerald, do not touch anything. Do not confront Derek. Do not move any funds. Come to my office tomorrow morning and bring everything Raymond gave you." I did exactly that. What followed was 6 weeks of the most disciplined restraint I have ever practiced in my life. Patricia worked with a forensic accountant. She trusted a former IRS investigator named Carl, and together they documented everything, every transfer, every false invoice, every communication they could legally access. The forged signature went to a document examiner. The Shell LLC was traced. The share transfers to Derek from my old friends were examined for whether proper procedure had been followed, and in both cases, it had not. Derek had misrepresented material facts to get those men to sell. That made the transfers potentially voidable. Meanwhile, I went to the office. I attended the meetings I was invited to. I smiled. I asked Derek how things were going. He'd say, "Great, Dad, really great," and I'd nod and say I was proud of him. Brittany came to the office a few times during this period. She always greeted me warmly, always asked how I was holding up since Carol, always touched my arm in that practiced, sympathetic way. I smiled back every time. Patricia also quietly secured a temporary restraining order on the fraudulent trust document, filed under seal so Derek wouldn't be alerted, and she filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Secretary of State regarding the irregularities in the share transfer process. The morning Derek decided to make his move, I almost didn't see it coming, not because I wasn't prepared, but because I hadn't expected him to do it quite so publicly. He called a board meeting, sent official notice to all shareholders, including me. The stated agenda was Executive Leadership Structure Review. Patricia and I looked at each other when I showed her the notice. We both knew what it meant. He thought he had the votes. He thought the documentation was in place. He thought he was walking into a room where he was going to become the sole authority of a company that no longer had me in it. He didn't know that Patricia had spent the previous 3 days preparing a counterfiling. He didn't know that Carl's forensic report was complete. He didn't know about the restraining order on the trust document. He didn't know that the two minority shareholders, once they understood they had been deceived, had both agreed to cooperate with the legal process and had signed sworn statements to that effect. And he didn't know that I'd arrived at the office 45 minutes before the meeting and had a quiet conversation with every person in that building who needed to know what was about to happen. The conference room filled at 9 o'clock. Derek sat at the head of the table, my table, the one I'd bought at an auction in 1998 with his lawyer beside him and Brittany in the chair against the wall, which wasn't protocol, but which nobody had corrected. 2 of our senior employees were there. Patricia sat next to me. Derek glanced at her with mild curiosity, but not alarm. He didn't know her. He opened the meeting with the efficiency of a man who has rehearsed. He talked about the company's future. He talked about vision and momentum and the importance of clear leadership structures. He talked about me with a kind of respectful language people use to describe someone they're retiring against their will phrases, like legacy, foundation, the right time to transition. Then he slid a packet of documents across the table to me and said, "Dad, we've made it official. It's time for you to step back." I let the room go quiet. I looked at the papers. I looked at my son. Then I turned to his lawyer, a young man I didn't recognize. Someone Derek had hired privately, and I asked him, very calmly, "Counselor, are you aware that the trust instrument your client is relying on to initiate this action, was placed under a temporary restraining order by the Franklin County Court of Common Pleas 8 days ago. The lawyer blinked. I reached into the folder Patricia had prepared and placed the court order on the table in front of him. His face went the color of old chalk. Derek said, "What?" The word came out small, like the air had been taken from it. Patricia spoke then. She introduced herself. She explained precisely and without drama what had been discovered over the previous 6 weeks. The diverted funds, the forged signature, the Shell LLC, the misrepresentation to the minority shareholders. She placed Carl's forensic report on the table. She placed the document examiner's report on the forged signature on the table. She placed the sworn statements from the 2 minority shareholders on the table. The room was absolutely silent. Derek's lawyer leaned over and said something to him very quietly. Derek's face had gone through several colors by then and had settled on something grayish. Brittany, against the wall, had stopped looking like someone who was watching a victory and started looking like someone watching a car accident. Derek looked at me. For a moment I thought he might try to argue. I could see him calculating, looking for the angle, the way he always had since he was a kid, trying to get out of being grounded. Then something in his face shifted. I don't know what to call it exactly. Not remorse, not yet. More like the moment you realize the door you are running toward is actually a wall. He said, "Dad." I said, "Don't." Not angry, not loud, just the word. He stopped. Patricia informed Derek's lawyer that the company's own legal counsel, who had been notified and was filing documentation that morning, would be in touch regarding next steps. The meeting was adjourned. It had lasted 22 minutes. Derek and Brittany left without speaking to me. I watched them walk through the office, past the employees who knew, past the framed photo on the wall near reception, me and Carol at the ribbon cutting in 1993, both of us laughing at something someone off camera had said. I don't know if Derek looked at that photo. I hope he did. What happened after wasn't fast, and I'm not going to pretend it was simple. These things never are. Derek and Brittany retained their own legal team. There were negotiations. There were difficult conversations with our employees about the company's stability. Conversations I insisted on having personally and honestly. The forensic accountant's findings were turned over to prosecutors. I was told early on that criminal charges were likely, but that the process would take time. They were right. 8 months later, Derek pled guilty to 1 count of wire fraud and 1 count of forgery. He was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison and ordered to pay full restitution, which, given that the company was now the victim party, meant paying back the company he had tried to steal. Brittany pled to a lesser charge related to the Shell LLC and received 18 months probation and 250 hours of community service. Her plea required full cooperation, which meant she testified to everything she knew. The 2 minority shareholders were made whole through a negotiated settlement. Raymond, the accountant, continued as our accountant. I gave him a raise. He cried a little and told me he didn't deserve it. I told him he was wrong. The company survived. It took effort. There was a period of uncertainty with some of our hospital contracts, while the legal situation was public, and I had to have a lot of conversations I didn't want to have. But the underlying business was sound. Derek had been redirecting money, but he hadn't broken the operations. The relationships we'd built over 30 years were real. People stuck with us. I promoted a woman named Diane, our director of operations, to interim CEO while things stabilized. She was methodical, trustworthy, and had been with us for 14 years. Within 6 months, interim became permanent. The hardest part wasn't the legal process. The hardest part was the night, about 2 weeks after the board meeting, when I was sitting alone in the house, and it occurred to me that I had just watched my only child be led toward a federal indictment, and I had been the one who set it in motion. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters. I didn't feel triumphant that night. I felt something closer to grief. Not because I thought I had done the wrong thing, I hadn't. What Derek did was a crime, and he did it to me and to the people who worked for us and to the memory of his mother, who had given everything to build what he tried to take. Letting it go would have been a betrayal of all of that, but he was still my son. And whatever he had become, I could remember who he'd been. I could remember teaching him to ride a bike in the parking lot behind the first office. I could remember him calling me from college, scared before his first big exam, and me telling him he was more prepared than he knew. I could remember the way he'd looked at Carol's funeral lost, genuinely lost. The way you look when the person who always made things make sense is suddenly just Gone. I don't know when the shift happened in him. I don't know if it was Brittany's influence or grief or ambition or something that had always been in there that I hadn't wanted to see. Probably some mixture of all of it. I won't pretend to have the full answer. What I know is this. The company Carol and I built is still standing. The people who depend on it still have their jobs and their livelihoods. The man who forged my signature and stole from the people who trusted him was held accountable under the law. And I did all of it without yelling, without threatening, without doing a single thing I would be ashamed to explain to anyone who asked. I still go into the office 4 days a week. Not because Diane needs me hovering, she doesn't, but because the work still means something to me. And I think meaning something is a reason good enough to get out of bed. There's a letter I haven't decided what to do with yet. It came 3 months ago, postmarked from the federal facility in Elkton. Derek's handwriting on the envelope. I've held it. I've set it down. I've picked it up again a dozen times. I haven't opened it. Maybe I will. Maybe I won't. I'm not in a hurry. Carol used to say that the strongest thing a person can do is stay calm when the world is trying to make them frantic. She was right about most things. She was definitely right about that. I stayed calm. I asked one question. And everything that came after every consequence, every reckoning, every moment of justice, came from that one quiet question in a conference room on a Tuesday morning in Columbus, Ohio. I don't regret it. Not for a single second.